I'm so happy and excited to be here with you all today. I want to tell you about the research that I've been doing on gender equity in academic medicine, but also how I got into it, why I've been studying this, why you're listening to a business professor, that sort of thing. And if you have questions, feel free to interrupt, raise your hand, especially if they're more like clarification questions. We'll have time for discussion and sort of getting deeper into anything at the end as well. So I'll make sure we have time for that. So you guys all know the statistics, I'm sure, on gender equity in academic medicine. At the med school level, you have women entering and graduating from medical school at equal rates to men. And then as you get higher and higher levels of influence and prestige, you see fewer and fewer women in those roles. It's not surprising. I think 20, 30 years ago, we thought if we just waited around long enough, this problem would sort of remedy itself, right? We just had to wait for all those women to graduate medical school and time would fix this pipeline problem. And we've been waiting long enough to know that that's not the whole picture. That's not the end of the story. And I actually think, as a side note, there's a lot of other areas in STEM fields and engineering and computer science where they're expecting the exact same thing to happen, right? They're just waiting for the young girls that are now interested in math and science to come up through the system. And medicine really has an opportunity to be a leader in saying it's not just enough to pique people's interest, right? It's a really good start, but it's not the whole story. And I know you can't see these slides. Just want to add in that some of my newest research is looking specifically at women of color in academic medicine. And right now, only 2.5% of all full-time academic medicine faculty are Black or Hispanic women. So it's a particularly sort of stark reality when you start to look at those numbers. So that's my mom. And there's a reason why this is up here. So why I started studying this topic was because my mom was sort of part of the women's liberation, women can do everything, women are equal to men generation, and that message really was sent to me, right? She said, you're too smart to be a teacher, they're not valued enough, they're not paid enough. I found a sneaky way to be a teacher by becoming a professor. But the message was sort of, you have every capability to have a high-powered, high-profile career just like a man. And I wrote this poem about my mom when I was in elementary school, and I was going through all my files, and I wrote that she was rushing, right? So I was paying attention to this idea of she was working, and she had conflict, and I knew that I was supposed to get this high-profile power job, and I knew that I was supposed to have a family, but I was just kind of confused about how this was all going to work. That's me thinking how, right? So I was like, how does this work? And I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and I was looking at all these really smart women who were like, yeah, we can do it all, but how exactly, right? And I think that's the question that really started to intrigue me. It wasn't just about having access to the positions and the opportunities. It was about how do you actually make that work. And when I was an undergrad, my roommate was studying international business while getting her pre-med requirements met. And I actually just had breakfast with her this morning. So that was a bonus treat of coming to New York. She's now a cardiologist at Cornell Weill. And she's on maternity leave with her second kid. So we've been talking about how do you make this all work in medical careers for a long time. So instead of following the doctor, lawyer, engineer path, I went to graduate school to study this issue, right? And I was like, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to study it, I'm going to figure it out, and then I'm going to fix it. And at the time, my belief system was really that if you just make all the right choices as the woman professional, if you just figure out the right job and the right family and the right husband, it'll all just sort of magically work itself out. And that's what I wanted to study, right? What are those right choices? And I was looking for a career that had a lot of high power, high profile women picking from discrete choices and seeing how they worked it out. So the research that I did in my graduate career was on anticipated work-family conflict in medical students. Looked at how did medical students think about future work-family conflict, particularly with regard to what specialization that they were going into. and how did that play out into their decisions, and were some students better able to actually make the decision than others? Okay, so I was looking at this data. I know this is really small from where you guys are all sitting, but basically showing there's gender differences across the different specialties, and you all already know this. And so what I did was I interviewed and surveyed a bunch of doctors from all the different specialties. And I asked them about, again, I don't expect you to see this, the hours of work in that specialty, the control over the hours, and the pace of the work. 3 workplace factors that we know have a strong relationship to burnout, work-family conflict, et cetera. Then I went and I interviewed and I surveyed the medical students. And to a T, they all knew this information exactly. They knew exactly which specialties had the highest forms of time-based conflict or strain-based conflict or spillover. They knew it all. And yet, they had absolutely no intention of using that information to inform their career decisions. They were just like, yes, we know this, and we want to have a good balance between work and the rest of our life, but they just didn't use that information in their decision making. They kind of ignored it. And I even asked them things like, how many hours a week do you think you'll work? How many hours do you think your spouse will work? Are you gonna have a nanny or a housekeeper? And the math, they were just gonna magically create extra hours in the week. And that was their strategy as medical students. And I was like, okay, well that raised more questions than answers, right? About this decision-making process. But I still had this frame of mind that it was about the individual person. Right? That if the individual person made the individual right choices, then they could have this perfect life. And I know that in hindsight now, with some life behind me, that sounds really silly, but at the time, that's how I was thinking. So I finished up this research. It was my thesis. I did an experiment on this topic for my dissertation, and I accepted a management position at DePaul University in Chicago. And a week before I was supposed to start at DePaul University, my mom was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. So she was diagnosed with glioblastoma multiforme. And they said 3 to 6 months. That's it. And this was a week before I was supposed to start my job. And it, at that point, dawned on me oh, this isn't just about making the right choices. I didn't choose to have a sick parent. So I went to my boss literally before I had worked a day, and I had my teaching schedule adjusted, and they rearranged everything and found coverage for me so that I could travel home for longer stretches to be with my family. And that's when I started thinking about, wow, this is really about the workplace too, right? This isn't just about the right person. It's about a workplace that values their employees in a way that facilitates work-life balance and allowing me to be home. So I started to think more about the culture of work and those assumptions, those hidden assumptions in the workplace that impact career progress and work-life balance. And certainly, had I not had those accommodations, it would have been a much tougher road to career success and tenure for me. And at the same time, academic medicine and the National Institutes of Health were changing their thinking. Right? So it was sort of this serendipitous time when the National Academies Press published a seminal report called Beyond Bias and Barriers. And they said, this isn't just about men and women being interested in different careers. It's not just about who wants it and who leans into it. It's about the unrecognized features of the organizational culture that affect men and women differently. So this was a perfect time for me to sort of shift my research from a focus just on what can women do right to make this better, to what can the system do to allow everyone to thrive. And we can certainly have a conversation about a lot of these things. This is not just about women's careers, right? This is about creating a workplace that allows everyone to be successful and to thrive, and we can talk more about that for sure. So in 2009, the NIH made a call for proposals looking at causal factors that promote and support the careers of women in biomedical, behavioral science, and engineering. So it's an R01. And I, because of my research on medical students, and because of my connections to Penn, was asked to join a research team at the University of Pennsylvania as a co-investigator. So the two PIs on that project are Stephanie Abule and J.A. Grisso, and their faculty, well, J.A. is now emeritus professor, but they're at Penn, and they, along with me, submitted a proposal to the NIH, and we were funded, and that is called the NIH TAC Trial, is what we call it, for transforming academic culture. So we were looking at how do you actually change the culture of medicine to promote the careers of women. And there were 14 different projects funded by the NIH in 2009. We've since formed what we call the Research Partnership on Women in Biomedical Research Careers. So cumulatively across those 14 different grant recipients, we have 100+ publications on this topic, conferences, presentations, people will be at AAMC. There's a whole body of knowledge that has come out since 2009. So I'll tell you what we've been working on and share that, but there's more data, more material out there, and we're actually still working to get more money, more funding to keep going with this, because as you'll see from my research, there's some pretty clear directions about where to go next. So I've been working with Stephanie and J.A. on this for many years, and we wanted to know, how does the culture of medicine impact women's careers, everyone's careers? So we call this culture conducive to women's academic success. And what's different about our approach to culture and the more traditional approach to culture or climate assessment is we're really asking people to describe their department, not their individual experience. So if you look at what people call culture measures, oftentimes they say, I feel supported, I feel mentored, I feel like my chair thinks I can be successful, okay? That's useful information, but it's really just describing an individual experience. What we were looking at is, are there differences across departments, and is there agreement within departments? And in some cases, we focused on divisions because the departments were 300 people large. So we're actually looking at the unit, and instead of each individual describing their unique experience, we're looking at how do they describe their unit, and not only that, are people agreeing? If there's no agreement within the unit, it's not a culture. It's just an individual perception, right? And you might think that this is more of like a statistical question, like looking at the agreement, but it's really also a framing question, right? Because when you start framing it as a characteristic of a unit instead of a characteristic of an individual, it becomes no longer a question of like, oh, that woman's whining about the way things are, right? This is something that then describes the department, not the woman. So we looked at what are these shared beliefs about the extent to which the unit supports women's careers. Another point we looked at is, are there differences? So not just is there agreement within, but if everybody agrees within the whole school, then you're really describing the culture of the school, not the culture of different departments and divisions. But that's not what we found. And we had a hunch this would be different across departments. Again, you can't see this. What we found is that there was significant agreement within units and differences across units, and that in the units with the best cultures, all of the women reported higher average levels of satisfaction, commitment, and lower levels of work-family conflict. So now you're not measuring my description of the culture and my conflict, right? There's a lot of biases that come because I am me and you're measuring things from me twice. You're looking at how the group rates the department and how that relates to my individual experiences. So it's taking out some of that common method bias, was what we would call it. Okay, and what we found is that clearly culture matters, right? And it mattered even more than what we had guessed. And I'm gonna just take a minute to show you some of this data. So to simplify things, we divided up the department cultures. Best, middle, and worst, okay? Now here we have the number of hours per week that the women are working, average was about 60. And here we have their levels of work-family conflict. Now, if we were just looking at, if we didn't divide it up by culture, just in general, right, you would expect higher work hours to be associated with more conflict. That's been proven 100 times. If you just average them all in any workplace, longer hours, more conflict, okay? But when you divide it up by the culture, the data becomes different and frankly a lot more interesting, okay? In the worst cultures, this is essentially a flat line. In other words, it doesn't matter whether you're working 40, 50, or 60 hours a week, your conflict is high, okay? In the best cultures, you have this traditional line, right? Longer work hours is associated with more conflict. And we found that women working 45 hours a week in the worst cultures, so here, actually reported significantly more conflict than women working 60 hours a week in the best cultures. And this is particularly important for a place like academic medicine, where people blame long work hours for a lot of the conflict, and that's certainly true, right? It's harder to have balance working 60 than 40, but there's a lot more to the story than just work hours. And we had the same results, basically the graph would look similar to this, if we looked at work overload, feeling like your work was stressful, rushed, high pressure, and the stress-based spillover into your personal life. So spillover where you're short-tempered at home and you don't have the patience and you can't disconnect and be physically present at home. Basically the same results, okay? So now I want to tell you more about what we found out about what are those differences, right? I'm kind of presenting this backwards. Instead of telling you the differences first and saying why they matter, I want you to see that they matter first, and then we'll describe what are those differences. So our research, and we did literature reviews, pilot studies, interviews, focus groups, basically both within medicine and outside of medicine, looking at what are those factors in the workplace that are particularly important for women in general, but also for women in medicine. And we found 4 distinct but interconnected facets of the work environment that constituted the overall culture of the work environment. So the first one was equal access to resources and opportunities. So in the best cultures, women felt like they had as much lab space, administrative support, mentoring, all of the resources that it takes to be successful. In the best cultures, women felt like they had equal access to that. And that's even really subtle things like access to socializing at the bar after work, right? Like who gets invited out. In the worst cultures, women felt like they had less of everything, pretty much. So that was one factor that differentiated the best cultures from the worst cultures. Another factor is the implicit biases, right? In medicine, implicit bias or unconscious bias has gotten a lot of traction as a topic related to both gender and racial diversity that a lot of people are talking about. So it's those subtle and unconscious biases about what defines a doctor, what defines a leader, and what defines a scientist. And because those stereotypes are more closely linked to sort of our stereotypes of man, it can play out in sort of hindering women's career success in a number of different ways. Who is seen as the ideal job candidate, who's seen as ready for promotion, and even things like who gets credit for ideas in a meeting, right? And in the best cultures, it's not that the best cultures figured out how to get rid of implicit bias, okay? If they figured that out, that would be a miracle and you wouldn't need me to be talking to you, okay? But what they were able to do is to talk about it and acknowledge it, okay? And in some cases, they took steps to address it. In other cases, it was just more like, yes, this is the fact, we're aware of it, and we care about it. In the worst cultures, if women talked about biases or subtle things that they noticed, they were just seen as whiners, and they were isolated or marginalized. So it wasn't a place where you could freely talk about this. Not surprisingly, issues of work-life balance came up a lot. Now, I don't have a big hang up about the terminology. They call it work-family conflict or work-life balance or integration or spillover, whatever. I know some people get hung up on the terminology, and if you want to talk about that more, we can. To me, we're all thinking the same. We know what we're talking about, right? It's finding ways to be successful in all of the areas of your life that match your values, right? Whatever those may be for you. I don't know why people have this idea that just because you say balance, it means like you've divided your life into equal pie charts, into equal sections. And I was like, I don't think anybody thinks that, but the researchers are very concerned that people might think that if you use the word balance. So I don't get too hung up on it. But in the best cultures, people acknowledged that you're allowed to have a life outside of work. It's not seen as being less committed to your career. It's not seen as less passionate. It's not seen as taking you off of an advanced career track. It's just seen as a normal part of life that we all have. In the worst cultures, you're seen as less committed. You're told to wait until a better time to have kids. Once you pass this next hurdle or this next threshold, then it might be the right time to have kids. And there's fewer accommodations. People don't take it into consideration when scheduling meetings, let alone promotion and tenure and all that other stuff. So it's just another way that we can sort of differentiate those best cultures from the worst cultures. And then finally, we have the role of the leadership. So in this case, it's the chair or chief. And they play a pretty profound role in how the department culture addresses all three of the other factors, right? How they feel about equal access to resources and opportunities, setting a tone for the discussions about bias, and of course, having a hand in both work-life policies and also just the day-to-day sort of assumptions about work and life, right? The policies sometimes come from the university or the medical school, but we know that the department chair or the leader plays a really important sort of filtering role in whether people are A, aware of the policies in the first place, and B, whether they feel like it's actually okay for them to use them, right? A lot of people know that a policy exists on the books, but they think it's career suicide if they actually use or take advantage of that policy. So those are the 4 factors that we found that really distinguish cultures in which women can thrive from cultures in which women are having a lot of stress, overload, strain across the board. Okay, so this is a pretty good starting place for our research because now we can differentiate between these different units. As I mentioned, or as was mentioned in the introduction, I can go to other medical schools and help them look at what their culture is, gather data, interpret data. A lot of researchers, and we even see this within the research partnership, a lot of researchers have a pet women's issue, right? In medicine, lots of people really latched onto this idea of unconscious bias. And they're like, it's great. We need to do unconscious bias training, and that's all going to solve all of our problems. And like you get like a 1-hour workshop, and then magically you're unbiased, right? And then some people are like, this is work life. It's not even a gender issue. This should be for men and for women, right? Everybody has their pet equity issue. And what I like best about this approach is that you don't have to pick, right? You can look at these as sort of separate factors that all play into whether a workplace is a place where women and men can thrive, right? So it's sort of saying, okay, everybody has to look past the one area that they like to hone in on. And it also says you have to look past the easiest and cheapest fix, right? A 1-hour faculty development workshop on work-life balance is a really cheap fix. Fix being in quotes because the power of a 1-hour workshop to really have a transformative, let's be clear, I get paid to do 1-hour work-life balance workshops. And I like to tell people like, I'm just gonna open your mind to some possibilities, right? And some new ways of thinking about things, but it's a really cheap, really quick fix. And if medical school or any organization is deluding themselves into thinking they're fixing the problem by putting this little Band-Aid over it, you now have this tool to say, actually, it's bigger and more complex than that. And that's a good thing, but it's also a really bad thing. Because how do you solve a really complex problem, right? In some ways, it does have to be incremental baby steps, but we want to have the bigger picture. So at the University of Pennsylvania, we got this grant, and we didn't want to just assess the culture. We wanted to see if we could change it. And we had all 27 departments and divisions at Penn that had at least 3 women assistant or junior faculty levels agreed to participate in our study. So we did a cluster randomized trial at Penn of an intervention to change the culture. Okay? And that's our trial design. I'm going to go through it. I really know you can't see it. Okay? So we have 100% participation at the department level. And remember, this intervention, we're cluster randomizing by department because we know that cultures differ across departments. So it's not that within one department, all of the women are either intervention condition or control condition, right? Not woman by woman, okay? So we had 134 out of 178 eligible women from those 27 departments agreed to participate in the trial. So then we gathered all of our baseline data, randomized the departments and divisions, and we had 14 control departments and 13 intervention departments, okay? And then here's where things get complicated. In the control departments, we just left them alone, right, as you would. In the intervention department, we said, this is a really complex issue, so we're just going to throw the kitchen sink at it, right? We're going to give the women faculty the training and development that they need to hopefully thrive and be successful. And then we're going to create department division task forces to address more systematic issues. And then we're going to engage the senior leadership to get them on board with all of this and to advocate for their women and the professors. Right? This is a huge trial. The PIs met with deans, department chairs on a regular basis. They supervised all of this stuff, okay? And then 3 years later, we collected our follow-up data to see whether anything had happened. And again, we had really high response rates. 95% of the original participants gave us data again. And we looked at not only their personal outcomes, like, A, do they still work here? Are they happy? Are they, did they get promoted? Did they have low work-life balance? All that good stuff. But we also got their CVs. So we looked at publication and grants, which obviously are criteria for promotion, tenure, et cetera. So we're combining all of this different stuff to see what happened. Okay, so let me tell you just a little bit more about that 3-tiered intervention that we did. And I know that this is a lot, okay? So for the women faculty themselves, there were 2 types of developmental workshops. They each met a series of times. The first one was focused on manuscript writing, creating a cohort of mentoring and support for academic publications for these women, giving them tools to be more successful in their publications, okay? The other half was called Total Leadership. And this is a program that was developed at Penn by Professor Stu Friedman, and he's a Wharton professor, and he developed this 20 plus years ago at the Ford Foundation, came back and brought it to Wharton, and all of the MBAs and executive MBAs at Wharton take this class. And it's really reframing the work-life balance thing as a leadership question, right? How do you act as a value-driven leader in all areas of your life? And I work with Stu now as the director of research for Total Leadership, so I help him evaluate the impact of Total Leadership. And it's also been, do you guys know ELAM, Executive Leadership, right? So Total Leadership is part of the ELAM program for developing women leaders. It's broadened at Penn. We now have a STEM faculty development program called Penn Pathways. There's 2 best-selling books on Total Leadership. So it's a self-help individual development program. And I think part of the reason why it's so popular is that it's framed as this leadership issue and a work performance issue, not just a women who want to make babies issue, right? It has this cachet of like, this is a Wharton MBA, got its seal of approval program, it's legit. Here's some results about our trends. So basically, we're looking at 4 different outcomes: total publications, peer-reviewed publications, first author, and peer-reviewed first author. And this line here says that our intervention group and our control group were publishing at the same rate, okay? So below the line means that the control group is outperforming the intervention group. Above the line is the intervention group outperforming the control group. So we had some kind of funky assignment to condition where the control group started out maybe outperforming the intervention group, possibly because we were making the intervention group go to all these sessions, which took up their time and made them do other things. But you can see that as you hit 2012, 2013, the trend is sort of shifting towards higher publication rate in the intervention condition. And my goal for this winter is to go back and harass all of these women for their CVs again to see if maybe we just didn't capture it in that time period, right? Between 2010 and 2013, we're doing this intervention. You wouldn't necessarily expect to see the output from that. I mean, we all know how long it takes to publish a freaking paper, right? You wouldn't necessarily expect to see the output, the differences emerge immediately. So I'm hoping that another 3 years later, we can see this. I'm also hoping somebody pays me to get that data. We're working on it, okay? Another thing we looked at was participation levels in the interventions for the women. So did they actually go to the manuscript writing group and total leadership sessions? Not surprisingly, a big complaint about those programs was that they took up time, and how are you going to give us better work-life balance by making us spend more time doing things that don't get recognized and rewarded, okay? So again, now we have this line means, so we divided everybody up into high participation rate, they attended more than 50% of the sessions, versus low participation rate, they attended less than 50% of the sessions, okay? So in 2009 and 10, equal publication rates, but we again, now this is a significant finding that the people who actually attended those sessions were out publishing the people who attended fewer. So the high participants were able to sort of reap the benefits that the low participants didn't. And again, you could come up with alternative explanations for this, right? The high participants were more motivated to get the results or more motivated to publish, et cetera, and that's why they participated. But it's promising, right? It also gives us a really clear direction for what you might want to try next, which says that if participation in this matters, then make it easier for people to participate, right? Give them some sort of compensation or time allocation for doing it. I mean, that's just one thing that we could try next. So this leads me to think about what is next. I mentioned what I'm still doing at the University of Pennsylvania, right? We're trying so hard to get that study published. And I'm hoping to follow up with people. The provost of Penn actually asked us to design what's called the Penn Pathways Program, which is a faculty development program for junior STEM faculty across the university. So expanding the total leadership, manuscript writing group, and all junior faculty development. But one problem that we've run up against with this is that all of this data is on women, right? Missing sort of important stakeholders in this scenario, which is men. Yeah, right? So the way that that culture measure was designed asked about the experiences of women. So women in this department have equal access to resources, women, da, da, da. And so one thing I've been working on is designing a gender neutral assessment of the culture. And there's lots of gender neutral assessments of culture, but they don't necessarily tap into these issues. So it's assessing culture focused on access to resources and opportunities, biases that are subtle and unconscious, support for work-life balance, and leader support. But we're not naming gender as an issue, right? It doesn't mention gender, men or women in the study. And we're going to look at how that measure gives us information about the nature of the departments and divisions. But also we want to make sure, as we're doing interventions, that we are not helping women at the cost of men, right? The idea here would be to help everybody have a more pleasant and fulfilling career. So I have really good pilot data on that, and I super duper wanted to analyze it to tell you guys and give you a sneak peek, but I just didn't have the time. So you can invite me back next year and I'll tell you what I found, right? And I'm looking at, can this culture measure, I'm doing another study, I'm just helping sort of in the measurement aspect of it, as an institution tries to implement changes to support their women faculty. Can we take these measures every 6 months and look at what's happening over time, right? Does it detect changes? So, but we're also thinking about how do you take some of what we've learned from this, but also what we've learned in the past 5+ years about gender equity in academic medicine, because I mentioned there's hundreds and hundreds, 100+ studies that have come out since that 2009 NIH R01, and how do we use that to make recommendations about change that's based on evidence, and to make sure that we're evaluating that change in a way that is appropriate, right? So as a business professor and sort of I'm an organizational psychologist by training, I can kind of take the tools of culture change and culture assessment and bring them over into academic medicine and sort of help academic medicine use the best skills for organizational research to assess and change itself. So we have self-assessments in the survey form of their work-family conflict, their self-efficacy, that stuff. We do have qualitative data as well from both the intervention and control group. And we went back and we did interviews with women in the intervention condition to see what worked well, what didn't work well. I kind of alluded to it earlier that they were like, we're too busy for this, so how is this helping us, right? There was sort of like this mindset shift of like, now you just give us one more thing. That was the biggest resistance to the individual level stuff. And I philosophically, telling women, here's what you should do differently in order to fix this problem, has sort of a victim blaming approach, right? Where it's like, if you just, it harkens back to what I thought earlier, which is if you just fix yourself, this problem will go away, right? And so there was some of that echoing in our feedback from our participants. I don't know that I would say in general they said that the culture got so much better, right? I just didn't see that. I do know that over that same time period, a lot of women in the control condition were experiencing culture changes, both from the leadership, and they were doing things like ELAM and other individual development stuff on their own. 65% of the women in our control group actually did some sort of faculty development program on their own. But no, there was nothing that made me think, oh, they all think that the culture is profoundly different. I'm not saying I didn't see it, I just don't want to say I did. We do have the racial identification of all of the women in this study. There was nothing that said, because the sample size is so small, of underrepresented women if you just look at the intervention group, there was nothing that said that they particularly benefited more or less from it. As a side note, PhDs in the intervention condition way outperformed their control counterparts, whereas the MDs were the group where you didn't see as significant of a difference. So there might be something about that role. But with regard to URM women, they were 5 times more likely to leave Penn during the course of this trial than the white women across both groups. If you ignore assignment to condition, it was 5 times more likely. And I'm writing that up as well. That was just a separate side note. That had nothing to do, yeah. So we didn't want to mess with our Penn sample, but we did pilot data collection at other institutions with women faculty about what characterizes a culture, and we looked at factor structure and item structure, and there were, for instance, some items on overt sexual harassment that had such a low endorsement rate that they didn't form this ambient culture, right? So we were looking at the data, and there were some items and some factors. Like you could think, okay, maybe, for instance, equal access to resources and opportunities is a resource the same thing, like a lab equipment, the same thing as mentoring, right? And we found within that is sort of one factor. So we did sort of the background work on the measure of it, but not with these women, because we didn't want to mess with our sample before we studied it. And that's published in Academic Medicine if you want more. I have a copy of it. So for that, we just divided it. Now, in general, it's not a categorical variable, right? So culture isn't good, medium, or bad. For the purposes of graphing it and looking at it visually, we just divided it into the worst, lowest overall culture score third, middle third of culture scores, and highest third. So that was a statistical thing for graphing the interaction, but the interaction is significant when you look at it as a continuous variable with each department ranked. In that study, you can look at the structural weights of how each of those 4 dimensions weighs into this overall culture score. So we weighted all of them differently, but when you do the factor structure loadings, you can see it. Right now I'm collecting, right now I have data at a New York place, a Philadelphia place, and a Tennessee place. But I don't think that I can draw any conclusions about geography, right? In my ideal world, the NIH funds a huge multi-institution trial, and the PIs of that trial think that my culture measure is so great that they want to collect it at every institution. Whether or not any of those things happens, there's a lot of things that would have to go right for that to happen. One of the conclusions about Penn is that people are so maximally incentivized to publish that it's almost like we're like kind of capping out. Like there's not that much wiggle room in terms of performance to get variability that you could use then that you could predict, right? If everybody's pushing at 100%, it's hard to predict what's the difference between people. Does that make sense? So yeah, I think that there's a lot of institutional factors that I would love to explore, but I mean, that's a holy grail data set for me. We have the data on track. We also have data on marital status and parental status. A lot of that we controlled for so that we could look sort of more in general. I don't think that any of we did like just like we did participation rates, are the people who are high participators getting more out of it than the low participators. We didn't see anything on married or versus single or childless versus child having come out in this study. But again, now you're talking about, this is 70 women in 13 departments. Yeah, when you start to get into those analyses, the sample size gets a little small for some of it. But yeah. Sorry, okay. So you mean like within the 4 different dimensions? Yeah. We didn't go into that. We sort of treated it as these are the 4 things that represent the culture. And there's nothing that would stop us from doing it by looking at the different predictors of each of those 4 things, other than sort of our conceptual treatment of culture as this sort of ambient experience for women. And part of the thought of the Penn team was that maybe the next iteration would have some sort of customization based on career track. So that this has both one size fits all and a kitchen sink, right?